Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's RENA London branch presentation. I'm Keith Lilly, the president of the branch, so as I say, welcome. Today's presentation is to be given to us by Chris Cox of the ABL Group. His subject this evening is Decarbonisation in the Maritime Industry, Shore and Port, a case study. A little bit about Chris for you that have not met him. Chris is a maritime data analyst at the ABL Group. He has a bachelor's degree in software engineering from the University of Southampton and 14 years of experience working with maritime data for incident or routine analysis. Since moving to ABL's London office last January, he has taken the lead development role in Emitter, which is an emissions tracking portal designed to help ports and other marine facilities or companies to calculate and track their emissions. Chris will give his presentation as usual, and then we'll respond to any questions at the end. So if you can please put your questions into the chat box and we'll deal with them later. So without further ado, we'll pass over to Chris, and we look forward to your presentation, Chris. So handing over to you now. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Keith. So yeah, as Keith said, my presentation today is about the decarbonisation in the maritime industry, and specifically we'll be looking at Shore and Port in the UK, who we've worked with at ABL in their mission to reduce their emissions. So here's the running order of what I'm going to go through today. So start off with an introduction and then move on to the types of emissions we can expect, the current and future regulations which are starting to come into the shipping world. Then we'll move on to actually measuring, calculating and tracking your emissions, and then move on to the benefits and challenges of doing this emissions tracking exercise. And then finally, we'll look at some of the potential strategies to reduce emissions and the pros and cons of each of those. Keith summed me up pretty well there, so I don't think I need to talk too much about myself, but like he said, since I've moved to ABL's London office about a year ago now, I've taken the lead development role of Emitter, which is our emissions tracking portal. And this was developed with Shore and Port. And essentially, everything that I've learned over the last year, we're going to be going through today. ABL Group ourselves, we are a energy and marine consultancy, and we're aiming to have our 50% of our revenues come from renewable streams. And so something like this is of particular interest to us. So a bit of an introduction. Although this presentation will be mainly focused around ports, they are an inextricable part of the shipping value chain. And so a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about will be applicable to the rest of the maritime sector. And ports and the maritime sector are coming under pressure now from stakeholders like the local community to decarbonise, and market-based measures, in particular to the shipping operators, are already coming into force. And this could then lead on to being implemented for ports as well. ESG, environmental, social and governance of a port, may also influence their ability to obtain funds from banks for CapEx projects. We've seen some banks start to implement this. So when a company asks them for a loan for a particular project, they will look at the ESG factors involved in that and make decisions based on that, as well as the normal criteria. And before a port invests in CapEx to reduce emissions, they first need to understand what those emissions are and where they're coming from. So that's kind of why we're doing this. Shore and Port themselves are a certified eco port down on the south coast of the UK, and they do already use sustainability as a key driver in their decision making. In 2020, they produced a port air quality strategy report in response to a DEFRA request. And they decided after doing this that they would actually like to continue to monitor their emissions on a more routine basis. And this is where ABL Group began collaboration with them. And we developed an online portal to allow them to track their emissions rather than producing static reports. Shore and Port have one of the closest proximities to residential communities out of all UK ports, which is why sustainability is a big feature for them. And so they're under increased pressure from the local community to reduce their emissions. And I must say that many of the figures and statistics regarding Shoreham's emissions in this presentation are based on either estimated or just example data. So take them all with a pinch of salt, and they're not all accurate. So starting with some statistics to see why we need to look at emissions in the maritime sector. So between 80 and 90% of everything we consume is moved by sea. And the shipping industry produces about 1 gigaton of CO2E, which is CO2 equivalent of greenhouse gases annually, which makes up around 3% of the total greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. To put that into perspective and to put that into different units, 1 gigaton is 1 trillion kilograms of CO2E every single year, just by the maritime industry. So even though we're talking about relatively small percentages of the global greenhouse gas emissions, these are still very significant numbers. Now, broadly speaking, but not always, ship emissions make upwards of 70% of a port's total emissions. This might be different if a port is heavily involved in industry on the site. And of those emissions, around 6% of all shipping emissions in the EU occur just while ships are at berth. And at Shore and Port, it's estimated only a small proportion of their emissions come from direct port activities, with the rest emitted by visiting vessels. And around 63% of those emissions are produced at berth. So that's a little bit of background about why we're doing this and some of the stats behind it. So let's move on to look at the emissions themselves. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol defines 3 scopes of emissions. So scope 1, these are the direct emissions that are under control of the port. So for example, harbour-owned craft and vehicles and the fuel burnt by those. And then scope 2, these are indirect emissions that are also under control by the port. So things like electricity purchased for the buildings, because the actual emissions don't take place at the port when electricity is used, it's actually at the power plant. And then finally, scope 3, these are all other indirect emissions that are not included in scope 2. So things like equipment and electricity used by port tenants, employee commuting, and then crucially, the ships that are visiting the port. And about 85% of ships' emissions are attributable to bulk, container, and oil vessels. So the specific emissions themselves, we normally split these up into 3 categories. So first we have greenhouse gases. These are the ones that go up into the atmosphere and absorb thermal energy to increase the temperature of the planet. So those are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. Those are 3 main examples. And these are normally converted into an equivalent CO2E value. So the level of methane and nitrous oxide are converted into the CO2 equivalent. So greenhouse gases kill the planet. Pollutants, on the other hand, are directly harmful to humans. So these lead to respiratory issues and also things like acid rain. So examples of these pollutants are oxides of nitrogen, oxides of sulfur, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide. And then other than these, you have your other emissions, which are a little bit more difficult to track, but things like dust, odor, and noise. So that's the emissions. So the stats I gave earlier probably provides you with the kind of personal motivation you would want to reduce emissions. But we also need to motivate ports as businesses. And one of the key ways of doing this is through regulations. So recently, in December of just last year, the EU Council and Parliament agreed to extend the EU ETS to shipping. And from the start, this will affect passenger and cargo ships above 5,000 gross tons from 2024. And so they will need to be calculating their emissions now for that. And the EU ETS is the emissions trading system. So effectively, ship operators will be paying for their carbon usage. And this is likely to be, or will be extended to offshore service vessels above 5,000 gross tons from 2027 onwards. And then also in late 2026, the viability of extending this to all ships above 400 gross tons will also be looked at. And these emissions will have to, for voyages 100% within the EU, you will have to pay for your total carbon emissions. And for voyages between the EU and non-member states, this will be 50%. Another regulation is the MRV regulation. So this isn't to do with actually paying for your carbon. This is just monitoring, reporting, and verification. So this was introduced back in 2015, and from 2018 onwards, this has been in place for all vessels above 5,000 gross tons. And cargo and offshore vessels above 400 gross tons will also be included from 2025 onwards. And also other greenhouse gases other than CO2 will be included, like methane and nitrous oxide, from 2024. And similarly, a UK MRV is going to be released in 2025 onwards, is the prediction, starting again with passenger and cargo vessels above 5,000 gross tons. I believe this got delayed because of Brexit. And then the IMO themselves have an overall strategy, not exactly regulations, but their greenhouse gas strategy, which the aim of this is to reduce CO2 emissions per transport by 40% by 2030 and 70% by 2050. And they also aim to reduce the total greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2050 compared to 2008 totals, which, considering that the amount of shipping will also go up by 2050, is quite an ambitious target. So let's move on to actually measuring your emissions and how we can do this, specifically talking imports at the moment. So if we go out to Shoreham, the first step was to define the boundary for which their emissions will be tracked. And so the red dashed line you see there are the port boundaries, and this was decided to be the area that Shoreham would track their emissions for. But also you need to define your boundaries in terms of the scopes and how far you want to take it in terms of which scopes you want to actually track. So scopes 1 and 2, you would normally have to do. So these are your scope 1, direct emissions, and scope 2, indirect emissions. So examples of assets at Shoreham Port for these scopes: scope 1, building gas, cargo handling equipment, harbour craft, and on-road vehicles. And then scope 2, electricity from their buildings, street lights, electric vehicles, and electric equipment. But then Shoreham also went all the way down to scope 3. which is when you start looking at tenants, electricity and equipment, fishing vessels, and also the seagoing ships coming into the port. And the reason Shoreham decided to take it all the way to Scope 3 is because they know that seagoing ships are the biggest source of emissions. And so they wanted to include this to try and find some way of reducing that. Now, you can track emissions through sniffers. So by putting up a bunch of sniffers around the port, tracking the air quality. But the trouble with this is that you're liable, especially in Shoreham's case, where they have a main road right next to their port boundary, just north of that dashed red line. And so you're liable to pick up emissions from other sources, so not from the port themselves. And also all you can do is measure the air quality and not actually work out where those emissions have come from, which is why instead of doing that, we decided to go down a route of actually calculating their emissions based on things like fuel consumption, energy usage, electricity usage, and applying some equations taken from the GLOME Port Emissions Toolkit. There's a couple of sample equations there. It's fairly straightforward, but you need your energy usage, fuel consumption, and then you multiply it by the appropriate emissions factor. And from there, you can then actually calculate all the different types of emissions in your port. And to take it one step further, Shoreham Port have worked with us to actually develop an online portal to do these calculations for them, and so they can view the results. Now, they did produce their port air quality strategy in 2020, but this was a static report. So while it did provide a good baseline for them, you're then stuck with a report on your desk, and it's difficult to then look at the data in other ways. So that's why we helped them by collaborating with them. And so this allows Shoreham to enter all their fuel and electricity usage of all their assets, and then automatically calculate the emissions based on the already collected emissions factors and formulae that are programmed into there. And then Shoreham can log in and view the results in interactive charts. They can apply filters there, so you can see all the filters on the right-hand side there, things like categories, the different scopes and periods. And the monetary value of those CO2e emissions are also shown there based on the EUA futures, which is what the EU ETS carbon pricing is based on, and the UKA futures there. And this allowed Shoreham to have something much more flexible. Rather than a static annual report, they can consistently look at their emissions throughout the year. And as we'll come on to later, there are many benefits to that. You can also start to look at trends. So an example here is the CO2e emissions from streetlights at Shoreham. So you can see that in the winter months, as the streetlights are used more, they burn more energy, and so the levels of emissions go up. And then as we come back to the summer, the emissions go down again. It's a very simple example, and we know why this is. But this is to show that an online portal can be used over a sustained period of time, and you can start to see whether your changes that you're implementing to reduce emissions can are actually having results. And you also get the granularity of being able to into your individual assets and see the emissions from them. So this would allow you to identify, particularly high emitting assets, so you know which ones to replace, for example. So that's the exercise we underwent with Shoreham. So what were the difficult parts of this, and what were the benefits that Shoreham got out of this, and why should technology be used by ports and other shipping companies to aid them in their emissions tracking. So the benefits of it, that internally emissions could be tracked to identify trends over time. And Shoreham are able to then identify specific sources of high emissions and target these directly in their emission reduction strategies. It can also help them to make decisions when it comes to CapEx strategies, because they can actually see the emissions data, filter it in the appropriate ways, and then make estimations on which emission reduction strategies would have the biggest impact. And you could also use a portal, an online portal like this, to model potential impacts of emission reduction strategies. And then these reports can be exported and then used in environmental reports by the port to provide to their stakeholders, and to therefore reinforce the port's dedication to reducing their emissions. So what are some of the challenges that that ports in general might face with emissions tracking? I don't know why these are coming through one at a time, but never mind. So many smaller ports don't have dedicated environmental managers yet. And so it can be difficult for them to find someone who has the time to collect all the data, because this can be a time-consuming exercise. Luckily, Shoreham do have a sustainability manager, and so she was able to spend the time to actually collect up everything that we need. And much of the required data is might not be recorded yet. So obviously this makes it difficult to, or even impossible to track historical emissions, for example. Tenants of the port might be resistant to collect and provide that data to the port due to the time and effort constraints there. They don't get an obvious gain out of it, despite the fact that over time, reducing their emissions could lead to reduced energy use and monetary savings. They don't see a short-term benefit to collecting that data out. And research has shown that the biggest contributor to a port's emissions are the ships themselves, which are scope 3, so not in direct control of the port. And ports are unlikely to be tracking ship movements in detail or collecting the fuel consumption data from them, or be able to get the details of the engines and the fuel types of the visiting ships. So what were some of the challenges that Shoreham had specifically? As we said just now, third-party tenants have been very difficult to get data from, as expected. Some of the current systems in place at Shoreham don't provide the sufficient data, so they might not be tracking fuel usage or activity hours for cargo handling equipment, only having the electricity usage for charging points and not for how much each specific vehicle has used. And so Shoreham have taken steps to overcome these, such as introducing fuel management systems. For the ships, so Shoreham were keeping track on all the ships visiting the port, which was great. We were able to use that to estimate their emissions. But this is still a manual process. And so we've been working to actually use AIS data to do this automatically and take away some of that time-consuming exercise. And it is complicated by the fact that ship voyages need to be broken down into different segments. So transit, maneuvering, when they're at berth. And so you need to be able to have some idea on how long the vessels have spent in each of those states. And like I was saying, engine data does need to be collected for all the ships visiting the port. This can be, there are many ship databases out there that you can collect the data manually from. But if you can find a semi-automated way of doing this or fully automated way of doing it, then obviously you're saving a lot of time. And then getting the emissions factors themselves. This was a lengthy task, and it is a crucial task, obviously, to do the calculations. And also some fuel types don't seem to have emissions factors at the moment. So for example, GTL diesel, which Shoreham do actually use, there are no accurate emissions factors available for this. And also Shoreham's electricity supplier actually use biomass in their electricity. And so when we were trying to get the genuine emissions from them, they were only giving us their net zero emissions factor, which, as we'll talk a little bit about biomass later on, isn't quite the case. So that's everything that you need to do to calculate your emissions and view your results. So what can you actually do to bring them down? So there are a number of options here, and some of these will be appropriate for particular ports, some won't be. So first one here, electric vessels. So ports can't make direct changes to the ships visiting the port, but they do have control over their own vessels, their pilot vessels, their tugs. And so they can make use of electric harbour craft to reduce their Scope 1 emissions. And this is seen as a possible future solution at Shoreham. Electric vehicles and equipment. So same as above, fuel-powered vehicles and equipment can be replaced with electric ones. Shoreham have already begun this process. They have charging points on site for both port and staff vehicles. Renewable energy sources, so using onshore or offshore wind, solar and hydroelectric energy sources can obviously help to offset some of the carbon emissions at a port. Shoreham themselves, they have their wind turbines there that you can see on the right, and they also have solar panels, and those wind turbines have reduced their annual CO2 emissions by an estimated 160 tonnes. As I've said a couple of times, the biggest contributors to emissions in ports are the ships themselves. So what can ports do to help mitigate this? One thing you can do, which is a relatively simple solution and low cost to implement, is to apply surcharges to high emitting ships. So some ports already do this, like the Port of Hamburg. So they target the high emission ships with increased port fees and then provide discounts to ships with low emissions. And so this has a knock-on effect of not only just reducing the emissions inside the port, but it also puts pressure on the ship owners themselves to reduce their ships' emissions. And so this is kind of killing two birds with one stone. And then also cold ironing, shore power. It's a big debate in the shipping world on how effective it can be and whether it's worth the extremely high cost of implementing it. So this is where electricity is provided to berth ships to allow them to turn off their auxiliary engines when they're sat at berth. As I said earlier, around 63%, 64% of ships' emissions at Shoreham actually occur when they're just at berth in the port. So this is a sizable chunk of the ship emissions. But unfortunately at Shoreham, vessels generally only stay at berth for a short period of time, and so shore power isn't really a viable solution for them. Then we have alternative fuels, and there are a large number of options here. And unfortunately, there isn't one silver bullet at the moment. There isn't one reliable horse to back in this race, but I've listed a few there. So LNG, LPG. So LNG, for example, this offers a 23% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to oil-based marine fuels, but it is liable to something called methane slip, which is where unburnt fuel gets released into the atmosphere. And obviously methane is around 25 times more damaging to the environment than CO2 itself. So, you know, you have your reduced CO2 emissions, but then you do get methane. Biofuels, so renewable fuels such as biodiesel, this is considered net zero by the EU fuel standards, but it also requires extra storage facilities at the port. And also, when the fuel is burnt, there are still carbon emissions, because even though it's considered net zero because of the carbon absorbed when the crops are growing to before creating the biodiesel, there are still the carbon emissions when that carbon is then released into the atmosphere. Whether it can be truly considered net zero when you take into account transport and distribution of the fuels is a sticking point, and can in a way be considered greenwashing. GTL diesel, gas to liquid. So this is currently used by Shoreham already. The benefits of this are currently being monitored by emitter. But the drawback of this is that it is more expensive than conventional diesel. And then hydrogen, which Shoreham are big champions of. And this is potentially a source of 100% clean energy if generated using energy from renewable sources. This does unfortunately require large amounts of storage space. And in order to be 100% green, you actually need an excess of renewable energy. And the reason for this is because in the electrolysis process where hydrogen is produced, which is when you run electricity through water to remove the hydrogen, you actually lose around 20 to 30% of energy in that process. So you do actually need an excess of renewable energy before you go into that. But Shoreham Port are committed to development of green hydrogen, or of becoming a green hydrogen hub, and have recently extended an exclusive partnership with GTEC for the next 5 years. You can also use just-in-time arrival for ships. So AI has come a long way. Digitalization in the marine world still coming a long way, and implementing this in ports can not only reduce times spent by ships sitting in anchor because they arrive when their berth spot is available, but also it can help to reduce their emissions while they're at sea. Because if they know the exact time that their berth will be available, they can use their voyage planning software to calculate how long it will take them to get to Shoreham, let's say, and then reduce their speed. And the speed of a vessel is there's actually a cubic relationship between your speed and your fuel usage. And so a small reduction in speed can actually have vast benefits. And so again, this is an action taken by the port, which can make positive changes further up the shipping chain. And then there's also energy efficient ship handling. So this is training for the pilots to operate ships more efficiently rather than just sailing them in as fast as possible. This can help reduce emissions during the maneuvering phase, and it's a relatively simple and low-cost strategy to implement. And a 37% of ships' emissions at Shoreham are produced during the transit maneuvering stage. This is still a big part of the ship emissions that could be targeted. So in summary, although there's no current legislation that targets ports directly to reduce their emissions, it's not unrealistic to imagine that the ones already coming into the rest of the shipping world will be extended to ports. And eventually these market-based measures will be applied to the ports themselves. And so a web-based portal like Emitter can help to ports and other marine facilities like shipyards or even ship operators to get ahead of the curve and identify the sources of their highest emissions and then take informed actions to reduce these. And data can be entered routinely by users making the complex task of creating a full emissions breakdown more straightforward. And like I was saying earlier, using technology in this way, rather than relying on annual static reports, means that you can take a more proactive look at your emissions. And then as I went through that list of possible solutions to reduce emissions, obviously there's no one single solution suitable for every port. Every port is different. Every port has different activities. They're different sizes. They handle different types of ships. So there isn't one single solution that can be applied to all ports. And so ports need to be able to look at their inventory to be able to identify and implement the appropriate emission reduction strategy for them. And also then be able to balance the costs of implementing these strategies with the results at the end of the process.